Hey everybody, so we're going to go ahead and I know I already gave you some lectures to look at for this chapter on reproductive health and wellness, but we are also going to get in a few more things and a few more topics in these lectures. So let me go ahead and share my screen and I will get started. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start out. Maybe. There we go. There we go. All right, so we're going to start out with some terms and we're going to talk about them in different sections. First, just some things you need to know. Sexual reproduction is the biological process of creating a new human individual. Reproductive health is the state of physical, mental, or social well-being in all matters related to reproductive system and in all stages in life. So that's a very wide and broad definition. Compulsory reproduction is the idea that individuals, especially women, are socially coerced into viewing reproduction as necessary and obligatory part of human experience. And we'll talk more about that here in a bit. Compulsory motherhood is the idea that women are socially coerced to view Stratified reproduction is a theoretical framework to understand the intersection of reproduction and inequality, which we're going to talk a lot about. And then reproductive exclusion is when doctors or medical practitioners negatively stereotype poor or minority women. This reinforces stratified reproduction. And for many ethnic minorities in the US, this means that there are perpetual invisibility and exclusion when it comes to things like prenatal care, good health care during deliveries, after delivery, interactions where they might experience pain or something that's going wrong. They're less likely to be believed, things of that nature. And we'll get into that a little more here in a bit. So some few terms for menstruation. The menstrual cycle is just the monthly process of ovulation and menstruation that almost every woman experiences. Now, again, we say almost every woman because not every woman has anatomy that functions in that way. And also not every woman who has ovaries and a uterus actually has them have a menstrual cycle. So due to different kinds of health problems. Menopause is the time when reproductive processes stop functioning and that usually happens between 45 and 55. Ovulation, when one egg then leaves the ovaries, travels down the fallopian tubes into the uterus. And that is when the period when you are most fertile, when you are most capable of getting pregnant. Conception is the pregnancy, or contraceptive is the pregnancy preventative methods. And we'll talk about those here in a bit too. The premenstrual syndrome or PMS is a group of physical and mood-based symptoms that women can experience prior to menstruation. Right, and then we're going to get back out here. We're going to talk about some terms when it comes to mothering, because these are going to be very important to understanding. Racialized mothering, or the attribution of distinct mothering approaches for particular racial groups. And this can be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be a bad thing when you start making stereotypical assumptions about a particular kind of mother or particular group of mothers. On the other hand, it can be very community driven if that particular kind of mothering is something embodied by the community and that community particularly embraces and outwardly expresses. Maternal mortality is just the death of a woman while pregnant or within 42 days of the termination of pregnancy. This also is for during childbirth and or directly post childbirth. So racism of this form is specific to medical encounters of OBGYNs. Infant mortality is the death of a child under the age of 1. So that can happen like right after birth. It can happen during the birthing process, or it can be anywhere before they turn 1. The technocratic model of birthing is essentially highlights the OBGYN, it highlights the medical process, and it's controlled most and regulated mostly by doctors and scientists who claim they know the most about women's reproductive systems. Ironically, most of this research is also done by men, and most OBGYNs are men. So there have been large amounts of critiques on exactly how these models benefit with women, listen to women, empower women, embody their voices, and their long history of doing things counterproductive to birthing, like strapping women down, like, you know, giving birth with your legs up in the air as opposed to letting gravity help, these kinds of things. A cesarean section is a surgical medical operation for delivering a child, where you cut through the wall of the mother's abdomen and into the womb, and then you bring the baby out that direction through the abdomen, and then she is surgically sewn up, and the recovery time tends to be a lot more challenging than a natural birth, with no complications, and it's an actual surgery site. A designer birth is this new term to describe a planned cesarean surgery, and a tummy tuck is done at the same time, immediately following delivery. And then there's also the midwifery model of births, which highlights the midwife, which is a highly trained personnel who have trained in the perspectives and understandings of women's bodies and women's birthing practices across multiple cultures, in order to best provide a non-medical birth in the most female positive way. And again, it's based on women's perspectives, and it views women's bodies as healthy and has an overall trust of nature and the birthing process. You can also have a joint way of doing this, where you have midwives with you, or a midwife in the hospital with you to deliver. That is also an option. It's not just one or the other. There are multiple different kinds of birthing plans, and multiple different ways in which births happen. A wet nurse is a woman that is hired to breastfeed another woman's infant. This is also the term that was used for when any kind of slave and or any kind of indentured servant was forced to produce milk for the infants of their owners. And so this was not just for hire, but also for other things. This practice is mostly gone. However, there are individuals who still pump and sell breast milk and or volunteer breast milk to hospitals and or to other mothers who cannot produce, or for any other health concerns don't want to, or for any reason that they still want their kid to be on breast milk, but they particularly don't want to or cannot do it. And infertility is the inability to conceive after regular unprotected sex. So we are going to move on from terms, and we're going to get into kind of a couple other things. We're going to talk about breastfeeding. We're going to talk a little bit more about menstruation. We're going to talk about the commodification of birth, or this idea of making it a for-profit money kind of system. And we're going to talk about trans and gender nonconforming pregnancies. So when we talk about breastfeeding, so often in the media and or just social dynamics currently in the US anyway, there's this campaign that breast is best kind of social structure, essentially talking about how breast milk is the most beneficial to the infant, which is scientifically proven, yes, but it also depends on a lot of other factors. So it will depend on the ability to obtain clean water for the mother, the ability to not have toxins coming in from other sources. It also is impacted by poverty levels. It's also impacted by the ability to be able to breastfeed and be able to put the time into that while working. There's also a cost to breastfeeding in the sense that if you hold any kind of job or you hold any kind of other obligation where you cannot regularly be there for those feeding intervals for the infant, if you're going to pump in any way, those pumps are not cheap. And they, the bags that store the milk, all of those things cost money. There are workplace, again, boundaries to getting to being able to breastfeed. While it is a protected thing and you are legally required to get 15-minute breaks in order to make that happen, and they're supposed to reasonably accommodate a space to do that. I know that when I had one of my kiddos, I was working in a restaurant afterwards and trying to, like, the only place was the public bathroom and I wasn't going to do that. So I ended up having to go to my car. So reasonable space in the middle of a restaurant, or depending on your job, doesn't always happen. And then there's a lot of body autonomy that you give up to breastfeed. And while it is not necessarily something that everybody feels, it can feel very intrusive. It can be very painful. It is not always a pleasant experience. And it requires you to give a lot of time and energy, and you have to make sure that you have the calorie intake to produce. You have, like, the milk itself, once pumped, has an expiration time period on it. The storing of it in and of itself is time consuming. So it's that in and of itself, breastfeeding is, yes, the most nutrition based and most medically enriching for the child, because they're going to get the antibodies and the things that the mother produces to help the child continue to fight off the germs that they're experiencing within the world. However, it's also going to, it does come with some cost too. And so there's not a lot of conversation about the amount of time and energy that women put into that as well. So capitalism is very much linked to how formula really came about and why it was so popular for such an extended period of time. In about the 1980s, there was a campaign to essentially start, done by Johnson & Johnson, the company, I believe it was Johnson & Johnson that started it, but several different companies who were working to figure out a way to not get rid of, but like combat this breast is best kind of mentality and the natural processes that had been for so long. And really it came down to using this as, hey, look, this is cheaper. You're going to be able to do the things you need to do. You're going to be able to go back to work. You're going to be able to carry multiple jobs. You're going to have more time, what have you. You're not going to have to do that. All of the different ways in which they messaged formula was really about making money. It was about turning a profit. It wasn't necessarily in the infant's best interest. It wasn't necessarily in the women's best interest, because again, it deteriorated kind of those conversations that needed to happen about time that needed to be put in, about like maternal leave and paternity leave. It really negated some of those conversations. And again, it also requires the ability to have fresh and clean water. And it also requires you to be able to afford the formula itself. Formula is not cheap. It is more expensive than diapers, and diapers are astronomically expensive. So what ended up happening was there was a consistent messaging saying that this was going to provide a better kind of nutrition. It was going to provide more vitamins you could put in the vitamin supplements that they needed. You could put in this. And really what scientists really ended up finding out was that even the best kind of formula really is lacking in some of the most essential parts of what breast milk has to offer for infants. On top of that, there became this really big debate about breastfeeding in public, which is still raging. And it came down to really two arguments. There was this argument of indecency of a breast exposure to feed the child. There was this argument that was that was not okay. That was an indecent thing, because obviously breasts are a sexual object. They are a private part. They are something that not to be displayed in public. And that was kind of pitted against this argument that was, hey, this is a natural process that has always been the case, as you expect us to go out and be more involved in the world and be more active in these consumer ways as women who are with infants, then you also have to understand that these things have to happen and these processes need to be part of our everyday life. This has nothing to do with anything other than the nutrition and well-being of the infant. Sorry. And so really those two arguments really battled for a long time. But what was talked about less was this double standard, where women could come out in these itty bitty bikinis with the majority of their boobs showing, or they could come out with shirts on where you could very much almost see through them. And that was not necessarily being frowned upon or being considered indecent in the same ways that breastfeeding was. And so there was this double standard as breasts being these private parts, unless they're being displayed in these overly sexy clothing and in ways that had nothing to do with the health and well-being of children. So it really got into a very, very, and it's still a very, very elaborate debate. However, breastfeeding in public is protected. There, you do have a legal right to do that. And so if there ever comes that time, you do have the legal protections in order to do that. Most companies have jumped on board with that as well. Some companies like Target have advocated hard for these kinds of things, and even offer you water if they see that you're going to do that. They have a policy to offer you a cup of water. There are multiple big chains that now offer like feeding rooms, or like you can go to some amusement parks. I think Six Flags has them now, where they actually have rooms where it's just full of rocking chairs and kind of quiet ambient noise, so that way you can have these particular kinds of, like, you can do that in a way that's more comfortable for you and kind of limits that debate, that necessity for that debate. So getting into kind of menstruation again, there's an overarching lack of teaching of women's health in the public education system, or just in education overall, which leaves a very big gap in understandings of the basic biological processes that happen to the female anatomy. And so in not teaching that, what ends up happening is that most young girls start somewhere around the age of 12. Either they average at the age of 12, but somewhere usually between 9 and 14 is when most women start. And what happens then is that a lot of that can happen at a point in which that information is not given to that, and that can become very scary. It can be a very traumatic experience. It can be a very overwhelming experience, and without that ability to have those conversations, it becomes very shameful. It becomes very it becomes this socialized construct of guilt, of disconnect between the naturalness of this and how you feel about your own body. And especially in a time when puberty is happening, you already have enough of that. So adding more shame or feelings of offness about your body don't benefit the young girls. And so, I mean, I still remember when they pulled us out from our classroom, and this was in Fayette County, in Lexington, and they pulled us out in the 4th grade and sat us down, and we had to watch in the library. All the girls had to watch in the library this movie about periods, and it was like this super cheesy like movie where like it was like a little blood dot that was talking about all of this in a cartoon form. It was really, really weird. But I remember they like told us we could ask questions afterwards, but like all the adult teachers felt weird. Like the whole room just felt weird. And I can remember how like super weird it felt, but I wasn't weirded out because I had already had this conversation. I already knew what was coming. Like this wasn't abnormal for me. So like I had that information and that didn't make that feel weird. But I can imagine having gone into that, having absolutely zero understanding of that and just feeling like completely overwhelmed and scared because that's, you're not taught that bleeding is a good thing. So if you're bleeding in a way that is, you knew nothing was coming and pain is happening, that can be super scary. And so really having a different conversation about the education that needs to happen for women is something that has been a big push in both the women's movement and just amongst educators who educate that demographic, that age group. Again, menopause usually starts between 45 and 55. And there's been a big medicalization of this process, right? So like we treat PMS like it is an ailment that needs cured or needs fixed or needs treated, which in some case, some of those symptoms are things that are uncomfortable to us, that we don't want to experience regularly. We don't want to have those extreme cramps. And some people do cramp at a level in which is due to anatomical differences, is disproportionate to what would be normally acceptable range of pain. And so in those cases, seeking medical attention is a good idea. But for the rest of us who experience those on a fairly average level, it's still okay to treat that with the ibuprofen, with your Midol, with whatever it is that you use in that moment. It's not saying that process of taking something for that is bad. What is being said in this chapter is really talking about the ways in which the medical industry has specifically geared things towards and or discussed PMS as this horrible thing that causes you to be irrational, causes you to go do things that you normally wouldn't do, causes women to not be worthy of leadership. And that at the same time is something that needs to be treated with all these different medications, as well as you're also just being wimpy for not being able to deal with the pain or for letting your mood change or what have you. So like there's this double standard thing happening with this medical processing of female menstruation. And that has social consequences, right? So there's assumptions there that cater to or bring back this idea of irrationality or inability to control oneself or being over emotional or making rash decisions in that in making emotional, which has been used as justification for a wide variety of social consequences, from anything from individual like chastising of another person, all the way to, again, giving example why giving or using that as a reason for not letting women be leaders or into leadership positions. So really, again, there's a wide range of consequences that come with menstruation. And that's just in this particular US context. And outside of that, in a more global view, you're going to see the social consequences be even more in some places. Some individuals have to go into an entire another living situation while they're while they're on their period, and they have to go all the way out into another hut or outside of the village because there's this idea that is going to bring some kind of demons in, or some kind of or that's going to taint and or make ill any other individuals, or there's not able to cook during that period of time because the blood that is coming from a woman could cause the food to be unsanitary or what have you. So there's a whole lot of different social understandings of menstruation and social consequences for women globally due to a biological process that we have absolutely zero control over. So we're going to get into these last two slides, and then I'm going to pause, and we'll start up the rest of that on another one. But so we're going to talk about, again, the commodification. We talked about that, and that we could also talk about that when it comes to menstruation as well, just in the massive amount of feminine hygiene products there are available, and all of the ways in which you are supposed to use those, and use the best of those and spend more and more money on those, and how outrageously priced those are for something that is essentially a medical necessity. So when we talk about birth, though, and the commodifying of this, we're talking about the ways in which it costs money to give birth now. And that this comes down to a lot of that, that medical model, right? That model that's going to be seen through the medical industrial complex. You're going to see that and you're going to see that again linked to for-profit healthcare systems and the lack of just like a lack of a federal policy that covers all of reproductive health care for women. And that comes with a cost, right? So it costs on average $30,000 for a non-complications vaginal delivery and $50,000 for a cesarean section. If you have any kind of, if you or the baby has any kind of complication, that bill goes through the roof so fast. Because they're going to charge you not only for you being there, they're going to charge you for the infant being there. They're going to charge you for, and depending on how that particular hospital does it, the bill for the infant will go through an infant's healthcare that may or may not be in place at birth, and as opposed to the woman's. And so it gets really complicated. Because again, they're for a profit system. And so they're going to make it as complicated as possible. And they're going to make it as most cost beneficial to them as possible. And again, there's differences between multiple differences between all the different first world countries, but the US has a ridiculously high birthing cost compared to most first world countries. It also has one of the highest infant and maternal morbidity rates for a first world country. And that's, again, due to the fact that we're not listening to women's voices in our medical system, and our medical system is built for-profit healthcare, not built for the actual people that walk through the doors of those medical facilities. And because of this, it comes with a lot of hidden cost. Reproduction becomes a pre-existing, like just being able to be in your reproductive age. So again, that would be essentially what, 12 to 45 to 55 for most women. Just being in that age bracket, which is a good portion of a woman's life. You are considered of reproductive age, and that can be considered a pre-existing, well, before the ACA could be considered a pre-existing condition and could allot for higher health insurance rates. Now it's not considered a pre-existing condition. However, women's health care rates are higher due to reproductive health. You can also get that separate billing between the infant and the mother, which I talked about a little bit, but also between different apartments. So you'll have maybe a surgery center for the cesarean, and then a post-op, and then you're going to have a bill from the NICU, or possibly just the actual recovery room. So like they'll piece bills together in very cost prioritizing ways. And these bills can be very devastating for families and for individuals who don't have insurance, or for individuals who that pregnancy was not planned. Healthcare is one of the leading costs for economic ruin in this country, and it's no different in this case. And then we're going to talk about racialized. So, and if you want to get at the very beginning, birth was, for most women of color, birth for a very long time was in the interest of slave owners and or in the interest of whoever was going to like those birthing processes were a way in which for slave owners to get new bodies. They were a way in which to give, they were a way in which to hold power and control again over the women. And so there was a large amount of, there was also a large amount of slave owners intentionally impregnating slaves in very non-consensual ways in order to maintain or continue having more people to run their particular kind of ranch, farm, mill, whatever it ended up being. There was also a lot of experimentation and forced sterilization of women of color in our history, and especially within medical research. And I get more into depth in that in the other one, so I'm not going to touch on it as long here. And there's a lot of health disparities, and again, a justifiable lack in the lack of faith in the healthcare system, because consistently women of color have not been listened to, or have been a means to experiment on, or have been essentially rendered non-human based on the color of their skin or their ethnic background. So again, that's touched on a lot more in the other lectures, so I'm not going to get into that as much here. And then real quick, we're going to talk about trans and gender nonconforming pregnancies. Just for reference, there is pregnancies that are housed outside of the uterus in the abdominal cavity, and for trans women and sexual assigned males, or sex assigned males. Again, this is not something that's been successfully done, and so it's still something that science is working on. However, it's something that is plausible, and it is something that likely will be largely debated in the coming several decades of scientific research. Intersex individuals and pregnancy. So there have been intersex individuals who didn't even know that they had female anatomy until, because a doctor assigned them a certain sex at birth, or did some kind of reconstructive surgery at birth, and they didn't find out they were intersex until a pregnancy happened, or until some other until sexual reproductive age. There's also a large portion of intersex individuals who are also trans, and that can lead to a lot of gender dysphoria, and pregnancy itself can lead to a lot of feelings of not connectedness to their body, or their body not being connected to them as a human, and doing things or being allotted a particular part of female experience that they don't want to have any attachment to, or don't want to be associated with. On top of that, trans and gender nonconforming pregnant individuals receive a lot of suspicion and hostility within medical arenas, and they also get a lot of social sanction and a lot of social scrutiny, because that draws attention to the discrepancy between one's assumption of your gender and what might be happening on an anatomic level. And by being very outward, or having that very visible, it can be very traumatizing for trans and gender nonconforming people. And it can also lead to situations of where safety concerns are part of the equation. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We're going to stop there, and I will get back with you here in a bit to do some more.